I'm really grateful to have a chance to share a few words with you. I'm just sorry I can't be with you. First of all, because I'd love to have an excuse to be in Yorkshire. Even though I don't sound like it, my family comes from Yorkshire. When I was a child, we always went home to Yorkshire whenever we could. And secondly, it's strange to talk to you without being able to see your faces. I've been asked to talk to you about hope. And it's true today, the situation looks a bit grim. I flew back to England from Jerusalem almost a year ago in March, just before lockdown started. I thought it would last just a couple of weeks. And here we are, almost a year later, 100,000 deaths later, and we are still in its grip. You may be wondering whether you'll be able to get a job, whether you'll be able to go on for advanced studies. And of course, over us all hangs the threat of ecological catastrophe. How long will our little planet remain habitable? So I'm afraid there are lots of reasons to feel gloomy. So how can we hope? I want to share with you some of the reasons why I hope, and I just would love to be with you to hear why you hope. A few years ago, I spent some time in Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, and it was pretty grim. Terrorist suicide attacks were happening in the capital quite often. The north of the country had been taken over by ISIS, but I had a wonderful time. And I made many friendships, and I met extraordinary people. Just next door to where I was living, there was this home for abandoned children, and it was a place of tremendous joy. There was one young girl I remember called Noura. She was born without any arms or legs, and so her parents just got rid of her. But she was filled with happiness, and she used to feed the youngest children just with a spoon in her mouth. Now, you may ask yourself, what difference does this place make in the middle of a war zone? Does it change anything? But there are untold millions of people who are doing small, good things, good deeds, just because they are the right thing to do. And they give me hope. And it isn't just Christians. Recently, I was in Syria, and I stayed in a village, again, just near the front line with the terrorists. And they'd captured the local village, and they desecrated the church. They despoiled the icons. They dug up the bodies from the Christian graveyard, and they scattered them all over the church. And when the village was retaken, we wondered, where could we celebrate Mass? And the local Muslim imam came, and he said, where are you going to celebrate Christmas? Come to the mosque. Celebrate it in the mosque. So the first reason I have hope is because of the millions and millions of good people who do small, maybe small things, which help to make the world a better place. Think of all the people during this crisis, maybe your parents, the nurses and the doctors, obviously, people like dear old Captain Sir Tom Moore, the people who work in the supermarkets, helping us to be able to eat, delivery people, and of course, your teachers. You see, the media often give the impression that everybody's selfish and cruel and just after self-interest. Be critical of the media. There are all these people in whose kindness I trust. Think of the last words of that wonderful novel by George Eliot. Perhaps some of you are studying it for your GCE, Middlemarch. She wrote, "The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully hidden lives and rest in unvisited tombs." And as a Christian, I believe that no good deed is wasted. However pointless it may seem, however little it seems to achieve, every deed of love bears fruit in the hands of God, even in the lives of people who don't believe in God. In this difficult time, a lot of people are afraid of strangers, people who look differently from us or speak differently. But if you learn to see people's faces, you will see their kindness and their goodness, and you will see a world that is more hopeful. So that's one of the most important things I think any of us learn, how to read human faces. A Jewish rabbi once asked his students, "How can you tell when the sun has risen, when it's dawn?" And one of the students said, "Well, you know, because when you see a wild animal, you know if it's a lion or a leopard." Not a major problem, I might say, in Yorkshire. He said, "No." And then another student says, "You look at a tree and you can see whether it's a pear tree or an apple tree." And he said, "No." He said, "The dawn comes when you look at a stranger and you see your brother or your sister." If you learn to see human faces, you will grow in hope. This was a lesson that I learned really quite strongly during a trip to Algeria in North Africa 4 or 5 years ago. I had to visit the south of the country with a friend who was a bishop. We drove in his rather small old car right down to the north of the Sahara. There was a lot of violence in the country at the time, and we got caught up in a clash between the army and the local people. They surrounded the car in front of us, and they took the people inside hostage. But we knew that we probably would not escape because we were total strangers. We realized we probably wouldn't survive. And a young man stood in front of our car, hanging over the windscreen, with a big stone the size of a football, threatening to throw it through the windscreen. And I tried to catch his eyes. I thought that if he could see me, then he might realize I was a human being too. I might remind him of his old uncle or something. And as I looked at his face, the first thing I saw was hatred. But quickly I saw beneath the hatred, there was a young man who was sorrowful, who was afraid. He probably wondered why he got caught up in all this violence. And then I just glimpsed beneath the sorrow, I could see somebody who was lovable, somebody who his mother loved. I saw his humanity and his fragility, his vulnerability. I saw a brother. That's one reason why I'm frustrated I cannot be with you and see your faces. My second reason for hope is because of you. Every one of you have got your own gifts and your creativity in a way that some old people like me can't imagine. Remember Amanda Gorman, the young poet who spoke at the presidential inauguration. She said, "For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." That's you. Before the World Youth Day in Rio, Pope Francis urged the young people to be confident. He said, "Be confident." He said, "It's the young who want to be the protagonists of change. You are the ones who hold the future. Through you, the future will come to the world." Each one of you has your own gifts, your creativity. It may be poetic, like Amanda Gorman. It may be scientific, making new vaccines. It may be sporting or cooking, or a gift for making friendships. Whatever it is, use your gifts and be confident. You see, as a Christian, I believe that God came to us in a child who, as a young person, did wonderful things. And he died when he was still quite young, in his early 30s. God comes to us in the young. Now, some of you have been living through tough times during the pandemic. Lots of young people have gone through crises, physical and mental crises too. But crises can be moments of new beginning. Our old lives collapse, but we emerge new people. So we mustn't be afraid of crisis. All human beings grow through crisis. There was the first crisis that probably none of you remember, which is being born. You had to leave the warm jacuzzi of your mother's womb, come out into the cold air, and there will be a final crisis. One day you will die. Christians believe that that is the entry into a new life. And between, there are all sorts of small crises. When you cease drinking the milk from your mother's breast and you begin to eat solid food, the crisis of puberty, and all sorts of strange hormones go through your body, and you feel disconcerted and unsure, perhaps. There's that maybe a little crisis of leaving home, maybe getting married, all sorts of crises, quarreling with friends. And all these crises can be horrible. But they're also times, potentially, when we are renewed and made new. I was talking about this to a group of Americans, and they gave me a T-shirt which said, "Have a good crisis." I'm afraid I can't get into it any longer. I think I must have washed it too much. But let's go one step further. At the heart of my faith, Christianity, is the most terrible crisis that became our source of hope, the Last Supper. I discovered this in Rwanda in 1993 at the beginning of the genocide. I have an art of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. By chance, I arrived there when the violence was just beginning to take off. We planned to visit the Dominican sisters in the north of the country, but the Belgian ambassador came around and he said, "Don't go. It's too dangerous. The world is on fire." But we were young and foolish, even more foolish than I am now, but that's hard to imagine. So we traveled all day. The whole countryside was turned upside down. It was filled with the clashing armies of the rebels and the soldiers. We saw terrible things. The one that really stays in my mind is visiting a hospital which was filled with young people, children, also people of your age, 17, 18. Most of them had lost limbs, arms, and legs through landmines and bombs. I shall never forget one young child who'd lost 2 legs and an arm and an eye. And his father stood beside him weeping. And I wept. And I went out into the bush, accompanied by 2 kids. Each had 1 leg. They hopped because their parents couldn't afford crutches. That evening we went to the sisters. Their house showed all the signs of fighting. I knew I was supposed to say something, but I couldn't think of what to say. I felt entirely empty. And then I remembered there was something I could do. I could celebrate the Eucharist. I could remember that night before Jesus died. He gathered his friends around the table. But the little community was already collapsing. Judas had already sold him. Peter, the top disciple, was about to deny him. Most of them would run away. It was mainly the women who remained faithful. And before him, all that lay ahead was suffering and death. It looked like failure. It looked like the end of the dream. But at that most terrible moment, he did something wonderful. He took the bread and the wine and he said, "This is my body given for you. This is my blood poured out for you. It will be a new beginning, a new hope." So every time we celebrate the Eucharist, we remember that no crisis is the end. It can always be a new beginning. So these are some of the reasons why I remain hopeful, even though we're living through a grim time. I didn't want to spend my time looking at the difference between optimism and hope. I didn't want to waste time on definitions. You can argue about that yourselves. But I just wanted to share these 3 reasons why we can be hopeful. First of all over the world, there are literally billions of people who are good, do kind deeds. Never forget them. Be one of them yourself. I'm sure you are. Secondly, we put our hope in the young, yourselves. You will use your own creativity to do marvelous things that old people like me couldn't even begin to imagine. And finally, don't be afraid of crisis. We all go through crises sometimes. Every crisis can be a new beginning. The heart of my faith is that terrible crisis of the Last Supper, when everything seemed finished, but it was just starting. So thank you for listening, and I hope that one day I will be able to come and meet you. God bless.